Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The first face-to-face has taken place.
We had a great meeting today, actually, with the new Prime Minister, who's a terrific guy.
We had what I would describe as wide-ranging and, as I said a moment ago, very constructive discussions.
In his role as Prime Minister, Mark Carney made his first trip to the White House to sit down for a meeting with President Donald Trump, who greeted him at the front door with a smile and a handshake. Trump heaped praise on Carney while the two sat in the Oval Office, saying it was an honor to have him there, before the conversation got a bit tense as the two leaders stood their ground while discussing the trade war. They also had some exchanges around Trump's musings about making Canada the 51st state. Here are some snippets of that.
It would really be a wonderful marriage because it's two places that get along very well. They like each other a lot.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever.
But never say never. Never say never.
But how did the meeting go overall? What can we expect from negotiations for a new economic and security partnership between Canada and the U.S.? And how much more hard work is left to do, especially here at home, to cushion our country from further shocks? I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and today on The Big Story, to answer those questions, I'm speaking with Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat who served postings in the U.S. and was part of the teams that helped negotiate both the original Canada-U.S. trade deal and later NAFTA. Colin, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you again, Cormac.
So how did you think the meeting went?
I think it went as well as could be expected under the circumstances. Anything that involves Donald Trump is always suspect to and capable of going off the rails, as we saw with the worst example of that was Zelensky. But any leader that has to sit in that chair beside him in an Oval Office that looks like it was redone by the ghost of Liberace feels the pain. And you could see at moments on Prime Minister Carney's face that this was a challenging experience for him. But I think he handled it extremely well. And it is, after all, the Trump show.
One thing that I noticed that maybe you did too is that at times throughout their conversation in the Oval Office, it seemed like Carney wanted to say something, but he didn't quite jump in. Did he play that right?
I think he jumped in strategically when he had to, when it concerned Canadian sovereignty and what the Canadian objectives are for his meeting. But other than that, there's an awful lot of noise, and I think that he realizes that if you leave a hostage to fortune, Trump or J.D. Vance or one of the other acolytes might seize on it and have a go at him, which is what happened to poor Zelensky. So I think that he handled it well. Yes, it was, as I say, the Trump show, and sometimes it looked like he was Carney was the apprentice, but he made it through this round, and that was critical for Canada because we come out of this, I think, with not the lift of the tariffs, but some sense that there's going to be a process on various tracks, defense and security, which is what Trump is very interested in, looking at the Arctic, looking at NORAD renewal, looking at the Indo-Pacific, looking at NATO, looking at Ukraine. And when that'll run into Kananaskis, and he indicated that he would attend Kananaskis, which is an achievement as well. Secondly, on the trade side, no, the tariffs are not going to be lifted, and that was pretty emphatic. But there may be some movement on the fentanyl ones, which are particularly egregious to Canadians because we just think that they're undeserved. But we've got a process now. And then there'll be some kind of process around the economic framework as to what we're going to do generally. So it's now up to the individual ministers, and we'll get a sense of who those ministers are next week when the Prime Minister names a new cabinet, and their counterparts in the United States, whether it looks like Mr. Lutnick on the trade side and the tariffs, perhaps as Commerce Secretary, and Marco Rubio on the broader foreign policy side. I didn't see Pete Hegseth there, which I thought was interesting.
Now, you spoke about the process, and I think there was an expectation that maybe we might get some sort of date or something to launch formal negotiations towards this new economic and security deal that Prime Minister Carney had been talking about since his phone call during the election campaign, but we didn't really get that formal start date or any formal process like you would expect out of, let's say, the renegotiation of NAFTA under Trump's first term. What we got was Mark Carney himself, and not from the U.S. side as much, but Carney saying he believed that this is the end of the beginning towards these negotiations and towards resetting this relationship, and that he believed this was the start of the negotiations. How do you sort of make sense of that for our listeners when there's no formal process for that?
Again, we've got a brand new government on the Canadian side with a cabinet to be named next week. On the American side, while we have the cabinet in place, there's still a number of officials to be appointed. So it's early days. And remember, there's a whole queue of other countries, India, Japan. Japan's, I think, arriving, and they think they're close to some kind of an agreement. And about 25 other countries. Ours is a big, complex relationship. And I think that to some degree, we will move perhaps in tandem with Mexico. President Sheinbaum has not been to Washington yet, and I don't know what discussions are going on there and whether it will be a bilateral, which I think is what Trump prefers, or a trilateral, which we would like to keep in place. I think that we might see President Sheinbaum come to Kananaskis, and maybe there might be a trilateral. I know Albanese's been invited, Zelensky's been invited. It would make some sense, I think, to invite President Sheinbaum for Mexico. But these are things to become clearer. We now have an American ambassador in Ottawa, and that should help because that's usually the point person for following these things forward. But Pete Huckster's only been there a week presenting his credentials. So with his counterpart, our highly experienced and very capable Kirsten Hillman in Washington, there's that track as well to sort of bird dog stuff along. So we will see. But you're absolutely right, Cormac. It is we're dealing with Donald Trump, and it is very much the Trump show. That's very clear. The decisions on the tariffs are being made by him.
I guess my question is more, is it more political spin with Carney saying that negotiations have begun when we don't actually have a formal process in place? Or, as somebody who has been a part of a negotiating team, do you consider these high-level leader-to-leader talks the start of overall negotiations, even if a formal process isn't in place?
Well, I think that the signal is that discussions can begin, again, on the various tracks. Which moves more quickly? I think the Americans will be particularly interested in the defense and security one and the border one. But that will lead us into the trade, inevitably into the trade discussions, which are going to be difficult and complex because Donald Trump, we are one of the biggest three trading partners. The Prime Minister said it himself. For 40 American states, we're their principal clients. And he's trying to raise revenue from tariffs. That's vital for him to be able to give the tax cut to the American people that he's promised. So we are going to have to live, I think, with some form of tariff, but it's a question of what it is. In a sense, the auto industry, which is, there's the pause, but based on the president saying that if you qualify under CUSMA, you can continue to trade. A lot of companies thought that there was too much bureaucracy involved with CUSMA because the tariffs at that point, if you work auto trade through that, were about 2.5%. But now they're all talking to their customs agents and getting themselves sorted out so that the auto industry, because of the high tariffs that would apply if you're not doing it through CUSMA. So I think that's what we're going to have to get used to. And I think that's the message to the Canadian business community, is that tariffs are not going to disappear, but we're going to try and reduce them as much as possible. And where we can, get rid of them by demonstrating that it's in the interest of both countries not to have them.
Now, on the trade front, we definitely saw some clashes. On the sovereignty front, again, some clashes between the two leaders. But when we're talking about defense, I did note a big change of tone from Donald Trump. He used Canada's defense spending and investments as a tool, as a weapon against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and against Canada in all the months leading up to this. And then when he made comments about defense, He said, Canada's taking care of it. They've got a plan. They're investing. It seemed like sort of a very different approach than what he had under Justin Trudeau. How do you read into that?
Well, I read it that for Justin Trudeau, defense and security was not his principal objective. He was much more interested in social justice. Whereas I think, personally, I think Mark Carney really does get that. And if you noticed in the readout from the Prime Minister's office, they started with defense and security. And he's been very clear, even in his victory speech and in his first press conference, to put security at home and defense as one of his priority, and signaled that he's taking a different approach on that than the Trudeau government. And I think that's, the Americans have wanted to hear that for a long time. So they've no reason to doubt that we're not proceeding. And, again, actions will be important. But I do think that the government is determined to move there. And more importantly, Canadian public opinion is now behind them because they see that we live in a dangerous world.
All right, we'll have more on the big story with Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat, in just a moment. So, Colin, we've taken a look at the meeting that took place, but let's look at the hard work ahead. How tough will that road be?
It will be challenging. I think we start off with an agreement that is, in a sense, the successor to NAFTA. The fundamental pillars are all in that. And that is what we will go to the Americans with and say, okay, are we going to revise this slightly? Or is this a transition document? And if so, what is the transition to? What sort of framework are we going to have? We would prefer to work from the current document and make improvements. We'd like to see improvements because what you've done with tariffs, in our view, is simply can't happen again if we're to have a sustainable economic relationship. And then we proceed from there into the various baskets within, whether we're talking about digital trade, whether we're talking about telecommunications, intellectual property. There's a whole raft of things there, much of which I think Donald Trump, remember, this was an agreement that in 2000 he pronounced was the best deal he'd ever negotiated. So this is where we are negotiating from what was his favorite treaty, his favorite trade agreement. And we'll see where we go from there. And the question is, who will be the players on the American side? That it looked like Lutnick, but we'll wait and see. They may be Bissant, it may be Jameson Greer. That we do not know yet, but we will be pushing hard on that, and we already have pipelines into these departments. We'll be following up and saying, where do we go from here, and asking the Americans that. But again, keep in mind, Donald Trump has launched a storm which I do not think he anticipated would result in both problems at home, domestic problems. You saw after 100 days, the Americans are not happy with the direction of the country, and particularly his handling of the economy. Cost of living is going up. The ships aren't landing in docks, and he's made this comment about dolls for children, and I'm not sure that's going to work very well. So I think that we may have seen, in a way, Trump, after having run untrammeled for the last 100-plus days, Trump may have peaked, may have overreached slightly, and we may start to see opposition from both the Democrats. Kamala Harris gave an important speech a week and a half ago, and others are now starting to stand up, and also from within his own party. There was a resolution that passed the Senate with support from 4 important Republican senators, which said Canada should not be subject to the fentanyl tariffs based on the assumption that they're a national security threat.
Now, the Prime Minister also mentioned that the work isn't just with the U.S., the work is shoring up our economy here at home. Obviously, a lot of work has to be done with the premiers. There's talk about dismantling internal trade. How do we better set up our economy so that we have maybe more leverage as well at the negotiating table with the U.S. when, potentially formal negotiations begin?
Well, that's critical. The work at home is going to be vital, and it's the 3 parts. It's, as the Prime Minister has talked about with the premiers, and the premiers, we're seeing some action on internal trade barriers, reducing the 13 collectivities across the country and trying to make freer trade labor mobility, procurement, standards. But this is going to be we're now starting to see this is going to be tougher than some imagine. But there is legislation in Ontario, legislation in Nova Scotia. The Prime Minister and the Premiers have set July the 1st as kind of Liberation Day. There's a lot of work to be done there, and I think that's going to take a fair bit of the Prime Minister's time. But he can say to the Premiers, if you don't do this, we're not going to be able to proceed on that other track, which is building the infrastructure, which the Prime Minister is prepared to put money into to make us more efficient, improve our labor competitiveness, which has fallen significantly and also detracts from trying to attract foreign investment. But that's, again, the premiers are going to have to play into that role. And then the third piece in that, of course, is trade diversification itself, where, again, the premiers leading trade delegations abroad because they know what's most involved in their province. I think we need to see more of that. The federal government has created the frameworks. We've got 50-plus free trade arrangements. We don't utilize them anywhere near to their capacity. It was roughly 55%. We need to make better utilization of those agreements, trans-Pacific, transatlantic, into the Americas, for example. But again, the premiers will have to play into this one. So it's got to be an all-of-Canada approach, and that includes the opposition leaders, because who knows when we have a minority government. The next government, you want to set this up so that there's a continuity from a Canadian perspective in how we conduct our trade policy and our defense policy.
Alberta separation talk, how much of a roadblock could that be for talks with the U.S. and then internal talks with the premiers and trying to better handle our economy here at home?
It's a distraction, and it is Premier Smith appears to have let that genie out of the bottle by saying she's happy to see a referendum. It is unnecessary. It's like Quebec separatism. It's something every prime minister has on his agenda. Every prime minister has three big files: national security, which includes economic security; national unity, which we're talking about; and the U.S. relationship. And when all three come together, it's a challenge for the country and for the prime minister.
You mentioned earlier the cabinet choices, and next week the prime minister will be choosing his new inner circle. How key will that be in addressing matters both internally and externally?
My guess is that we've seen as prime ministers stay in power, but they increasingly centralize power in their office. And their office was, without doubt, in terms of foreign affairs, a block on things like, as Mark Carney's talked about in his memoir, the Indo-Pacific strategy. The Arctic strategy came late. The Africa strategy came out, and most people have no sense what it's even about. The Prime Minister Trudeau didn't seem to care as much about that side of it. I think Prime Minister Carney will care, and I think he wants strong ministers. I think he'll have a different style of management. We may get back to cabinet government with ministers being vested with decision-making and proceeding forward. I hope that's what we move towards. It would certainly make government more efficient. And we have a prime minister who has stated on every occasion he's much more interested in results. He wants to do something rather than be somebody. And I think if that's the signal that he follows through on, that'll be quite healthy for us in terms of being able to get things accomplished. As difficult as it is going to be in negotiating with the United States when we don't still know exactly who we're negotiating with aside from Donald Trump.
Do you think some of the current U.S. file ministers stay in place, or will he maybe just refresh the team completely, given his discussions with Trump?
Cormac, your guess is probably better than mine. I do think having brought down three ministers this week, he obviously has some confidence if he brought them down with him. But as he said in his press conference in response to the question that poor old François-Philippe Champagne was seen to ask, wait till next week and see what happens. So we'll. My speculation is only speculation.
All right, Colin. Thanks. We'll end it there. I really appreciate it.
Okay, good to talk again.
That was Colin Robertson, a former Canadian diplomat who served postings in the U.S. and was a part of the teams that helped negotiate both the original Canada-U.S. trade deal and later NAFTA. I'm Cormac Mac Sweeney, and that was The Big Story. You can send us your feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. Thanks for listening.
Did your last vacation house for the whole crew leave you wishing there was a better way to stay together? Like with bedrooms that are all great, so everyone thinks they got the best room?
Whoa! This is amazing.
A full bathroom in every bedroom?
Hey, mine's got a bathroom.
A beach around an epic, clear bay big enough for swimming, rope swinging, and even kayaking? All next door to Walt Disney World? Next trip, share a house at Evermore Orlando Resort. You won't believe what you resorted to before.